And God says, did you eat from the tree I told you not to eat from? She eats, she gives some to the man who was with her, he eats, they admit it, and God kicks the man and the woman out of the garden.
And this changes everything.
A dying woman sits at the mouth of a dark cave with less than 6 days to live. She is telling her son everything she remembers about the Garden of Eden, details that contradict everything the Western world was taught.
We read in the creation story that God created humankind, Adam and Eve, and then placed them in the Garden of Eden, and that this place should be understood as being a beautiful, life-giving oasis.
And the only reason you are hearing this now is because a group of Ethiopian monks spent over 1,000 years making sure no one could bury it again.
Ethiopia was the first Christian kingdom in the world. There's lots of amazing myths and legends surrounding.
What she revealed is recorded in an ancient Ethiopian scroll called the Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, a text sealed inside the remote highland monasteries of Ethiopia and kept from the outside world for over 1,000 years. What it contains about her final days was deliberately cut from the official record, and what was cut changes everything. The world that was erased. According to the Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, an ancient Ethiopian scroll protected from the outside world for over 1,000 years, Eve spent her final days at the mouth of a cave telling her son Seth everything she remembered about the world they had lost. She was dying, and she was determined that what she carried would not die with her. The first thing she told him was not about the fall, not about the serpent or the fruit or the moment everything went wrong. It was about the light. She wanted him to understand what they had lost before she explained how they lost it. He had grown up under the same sun as everyone else, in the same cursed earth, breathing the same heavy air, but his mother was describing a completely different world. The light inside the garden did not come from above. It did not pour down from a single point the way sunlight does, casting shadows in dark corners. It came from everywhere at once. The air itself carried it. The ground reflected it upward. Every leaf held it the way water holds color. It did not travel from one place to another. It simply existed inside everything simultaneously. And here is the part that stops most scholars cold. Dr. August Dillmann, the German linguist who translated this text from the ancient Ge'ez language in 1853, noted that Eden's light description had no parallel in any ancient text he had ever encountered. Not in the Hebrew manuscripts, not in the Greek, not in any Syriac or Aramaic source across decades of scholarship. That assessment came from a man who had read everything. After the light, she told Seth about the river. One of the 4 rivers of paradise was called the Pishon, and its bed was lined with gold, not coins or traded metal. The gold pulsed beneath the surface like a living vein running through the body of the earth. The water above it was so transparent that even where the current ran deep and fast, every shimmering grain was visible from the surface. No murkiness, no distortion, just perfect clarity all the way down. Then she told him about the animals. Every creature in the garden moved without fear, not because they had been trained into submission, but because fear was simply not part of their nature. They came to Adam and Eve willingly, as though the entire living world recognized them as its caretakers. Seth had grown up watching animals scatter and bite and kill. What his mother was describing must have sounded impossible. And this is the detail that almost every version of this story quietly skips. And then she told him about the serpent before its fall. This is the part that gets skipped in almost every version of this story. Before its corruption, the serpent was not dark or sinister. It was the most beautiful and luminous living thing in the entire garden, more radiant than any bird, more striking than any animal. What fell was not something that already looked dangerous. What fell was something that had been magnificent. After all of that, she told him about the tree of life, not its height or its fruit, its fragrance. She said it was not a scent you simply detected. It was a presence that moved through your entire body the moment you were near it, reaching into your lungs and dismantling fear so completely that the emotion ceased to exist while you stood beside it. Here is what makes that detail devastating. And then she told him she could still smell it, after centuries of exile. after sleeping on stone and eating from cursed ground. That fragrance had never left her memory, still as sharp and as real as the morning she was expelled. She was telling her son that the scent of a tree she could no longer touch had stayed with her for nearly 1,000 years without fading once. That is the detail that tells you everything about the weight she had been carrying. The memory of what Eden was is only half of what made her final days so singular. The other half was what she had become by the time she sat down to tell it, the last living witness to paradise, carrying a loneliness that no human being before or after her has ever come close to understanding. The widow of the world. Adam died on a Friday. According to the scroll, Friday was the exact same day of the week on which he had originally been created. The ancient writers recorded that detail on purpose. They were closing the first human life in a perfect circle. The man formed from the dust of the earth on a Friday went back into that same dust on a Friday. But Eve did not die with him. She had 6 more days. And those 6 days were not just a waiting period between 2 deaths. The scroll presents them as a direct mirror of the 6 days of creation. When God built the world, it took 6 days. When Eve released her connection to it, that process also took 6 days. 1 thread at a time, 1 memory at a time. The structure was deliberate, and it changes the way you read everything that follows. Think about what those 6 days actually meant. Every other person alive at that time had been born into exile. They had never seen the garden. They had no memory of it. The world they were living in was the only world they had ever known. But Eve carried the original. She had been there. She had walked through it, breathed its air, stood beside its rivers. And for those 6 days after Adam was gone, that memory existed in one place only, inside her. Solomon Caesar Malan, the linguist who produced the first English translation of this scroll in 1882, described the image of Eve sitting alone at the cave mouth as one of the most emotionally devastating sequences in all of ancient literature. It stayed with him long after he finished the work. That reaction from a man who spent his entire career reading ancient texts tells you something. She sat at the entrance of the Cave of Treasures, the place in the mountainside where Adam had just been buried, and she refused to eat or drink a single thing. This was not someone who had broken down. It was a choice. She was letting go of the world on her own terms, step by step, fully conscious of what she was doing, and while her body weakened by the hour, the scroll says her mind became sharper than it had been in years. The closer she came to death, the more clearly she could see past it. Her eyes stayed on the distant hills the entire time. She was looking for something, some trace of the light she had not stopped thinking about for nearly 1,000 years. Her children and grandchildren crowded around her and watched. They could tell something was happening beyond ordinary dying, but they could not see what she was seeing. They could not feel what she was feeling. There was a distance between her experience and theirs that no one could cross. She was at the edge of the living world, looking out toward whatever came next, and she was completely alone in that view. That was the real weight of those 6 days. Not the grief, not the dying, the fact that not one person around her could share what she was carrying. If you are discovering this hidden side of Scripture for the first time, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because what she saw on the 4th day is the part of this story that the establishment worked hardest to erase, and we are going there next. And then on the 4th day, something happened that nobody around her could see, hear, or prepare for. The chariot in the sky. But the visions did not stop with Adam. On the 4th day after Adam's burial, Eve stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her eyes stayed open, but the person behind them was gone. Her body was still sitting at the mouth of the cave, but whatever had been keeping her present and talking had left. Seth called her name. Her other children moved closer and touched her arm. Nothing. She was not asleep. She was not unconscious. She was somewhere else entirely, and no one around her could follow. Then the sky broke open. Not gradually, not with a slow parting of clouds or a shift in the light. The scroll describes it as a violent tearing, the way thick fabric sounds when it is ripped apart by force. One moment the sky was above the cave the way it always was. The next moment there was a hole in it, sudden and total. And what was on the other side was not darkness, not empty space. It was light so intense and concentrated it seemed to push the air downward as it descended. What came through that opening was a chariot, massive, blinding, moving with deliberate speed toward the earth, not pulled by horses, pulled by 4 eagles so enormous their wings stretched across the sky for miles in every direction. Those wings were not ordinary feathers. They were luminous, radiating the same light Eve had described from inside the garden, that warm, living glow that did not behave like fire or sunlight, but seemed to breathe and pulse on its own. The people standing around her could not see any of this. She was the only witness. And on that chariot, surrounded by ranks of celestial beings moving in precise formation, was Adam, not his body, his soul, escorted by the archangels Michael and Gabriel. This was the first time in the history of the world that a human soul had made this journey, and she was watching it happen. The vision did not end there. She saw Adam's soul taken to a place the scroll calls the Lake of Akarushian. The angels submerged him in water so clear it looked like it was made of light, and as they lifted him out, something happened that she had not expected and was not prepared for. The garments of light that had been stripped from Adam the moment they were cast out of Eden, the luminous covering that had been his original nature before the fall, came back, fully, completely. His brightness returned. His original form was restored. He was clean in a way that the exile had made both of them believe was no longer possible. E.A. Wallace Budge, the keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum, who spent decades working with Syriac and Ethiopic manuscripts, noted that the image of heavenly restoration through washing and the return of garments of light appears across multiple ancient Near Eastern traditions. But he said it carried an emotional intensity in this Ethiopian text that he had not found anywhere else. What that vision did to Eve was not simply bring her comfort. It broke something loose inside her. For centuries she had carried the belief that what happened in the garden was permanent, that she had caused something that could never be undone, that the damage was final. And then she watched Adam being forgiven. She watched his glory come back. She watched the exile get reversed. And she understood in that moment that death was not the end of the story. It was the doorway back into it. That understanding did not make her quiet. It made her urgent, because she had seen something else in those visions, something that reached far beyond Adam, far beyond her own death, far beyond anything her children standing around that cave could have imagined was coming. She saw the end of everything. On the dawn of the 5th day, something shifted. The scroll says a heavy stillness settled over the land, the kind of silence that arrives before something massive is about to happen. The people gathered around the cave felt it. They could not explain it, but they felt it. And Eve, who had spent the previous day somewhere beyond the reach of everyone around her, was fully present again. Her body was at its weakest, but her eyes were clear and her voice was steady, and what she did next nobody saw coming. She called for a gathering, not just the people already at the cave. Every living descendant, every branch of the family that had grown from her over nearly 1,000 years of life, across generations of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who now spread across the land. Word went out and they came, from mountain peaks and valley floors, walking miles through rough terrain to reach her. When they finally assembled and stood before her, they were looking at the entire human population of the earth at that moment in history. Every person alive was there. When she rose to speak, she did not look like a woman with hours left to live. She looked like someone who had been shown something and needed to report it before the window closed. She had nothing physical to give them. No gold, no land, no inheritance of any material kind. The earth was still wild and unclaimed. So she gave them what she had actually been given, which was information. Specific, detailed, and deeply unsettling information about what was coming for the world they were living in. She told them a flood was coming, not a heavy rainstorm, not a river overflowing its banks. A flood that would cover the entire surface of the earth and wash it clean of the corruption that had already started moving through the early generations of her bloodline. The people standing before her had never seen anything close to what she was describing. They had no category for it, but she was not asking them to believe her based on logic. She was telling them what she had been shown, and then she told them it would not stop there. After the flood, a second catastrophe would follow, much further into the future. This time it would not be water, it would be fire. A burning so complete it would consume the world as they knew it. That announcement landed differently than the flood warning. These were people who used fire to cook and stay warm. They understood what fire did to things. and she was telling them that one day it would do that to everything. But here is where she changed direction entirely. She did not leave them with 2 catastrophic warnings and nothing else. She made a promise, and she was precise about it. She told them that the human seed inside her own body would survive both events. The flood would not erase her bloodline. The fire would not end it. Her descendants would come through both sides of every catastrophe the world could produce. And then she went further. She told them about a specific person, one descendant, born from her own flesh, who would do something that no other human being in the entire history of the world would be able to do. He would walk back through the locked gates of the garden, and he would not go alone. He would bring every last human soul with him. The people standing before her were not listening to a grieving old woman trying to comfort her family. They understood that. What she was delivering was a direct report of what she had seen, and the authority in her voice made that distinction impossible to miss. This was the first messianic prophecy ever recorded in human history. It did not come from a temple. It did not come from a throne room or a religious institution. It came from a dying woman sitting at the edge of a cave. And that is precisely why the people who shaped the official record later worked so hard to make sure the world never heard it. She had now given everything she had. Her memories, her visions, her warnings, her promise. There was nothing left to say, and so on the 6th day, the earth itself responded to what was about to happen, the reunion in the dark. When Eve stopped breathing on the 6th day, the ground beneath her body began to vibrate. Not violently, the way the earth shakes during a tremor. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse, deep and slow like a heartbeat. The scroll says the earth was responding to the return of something that had originally come from it. The first woman had been formed from the same ground she was now being returned to, and the ground apparently recognized that. Her sons moved around her body carefully and deliberately. They had no guide to follow, no tradition to repeat. Adam's burial 6 days earlier had been the first in human history, and now they were performing only the second one. Every decision they made, how to position her, what to wrap her in, what to apply to preserve her, they were making for the first time. They wrapped her in white cloth and applied fragrant spices from holy woods, handling every part of the process with the kind of care that comes from knowing that what you are doing matters far beyond the moment you are in. They carried her into the Cave of Treasures. This was the sacred vault carved into the mountainside where gold, incense, and myrrh had been stored untouched for generations. These were gifts God had given Adam at the moment of expulsion, described in the scroll as tokens of a future promise. Nobody fully understood yet what that promise meant. The offerings had simply been kept, year after year, waiting. When they brought Eve inside, they did not place her in a separate section of the cave. They laid her body directly beside Adam, to his right side. He had been in the earth for 6 days, and the moment she was placed next to him, the ancient writings gave that moment a specific name. They called it the marriage of the grave. 2 people who had been made from one body at the start of creation, who had lived through nearly 1,000 years of exile together, who had lost paradise together and survived the consequences together, were now side by side again in the dark. The first relationship in human history ended in a cave on the side of a mountain, and it ended the same way it had begun, together. And then something happened that nobody outside the cave could explain. The gold and spices that had been sitting dormant in that vault for generations suddenly released a fragrance so strong it traveled for miles outside the mountain. People standing far from the entrance smelled something they had no words for. It did not match any plant or flower or combination of natural things they had ever encountered in the world they lived in. The scroll says those offerings had been holding that fragrance since the day they were brought out of Eden, and they only released it at this exact moment, when the 2 people who had walked out of the garden together were finally permanently reunited. That fragrance did not appear by accident. It meant something. And understanding what it meant requires understanding why everything you have just heard was kept from you, deliberately, and for a very long time. The testimony they buried. Here is the part that should make you angry. Everything you just heard, the visions, the prophecy, the chariot, the restoration of Adam's soul, the marriage of the grave, the fragrance that traveled for miles, none of it appears in the version of this story that most of the world was given. Not because it was lost, not because the records were damaged or destroyed by time. It was removed deliberately, carefully, and by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The people who controlled which ancient texts would be preserved and which would be set aside had a specific problem with Eve. Not Eve the transgressor. They were perfectly comfortable with that version. The problem was Eve the prophet, Eve the visionary, Eve the woman who delivered the first messianic promise in human history while standing at the edge of a cave with hours left to live. That version of her was dangerous, and they could not allow it to survive in the official record. So they made a decision. They kept the fall and removed everything that came after it. Her death was cut. Her visions were cut. The gathering of her descendants was cut. The chariot, the lake of Acherusian, the restoration of Adam's garments of light, the supernatural fragrance in the cave, all of it was stripped away. What they left behind was a woman who existed in the text for one purpose only, to make a mistake. Everything that showed her as something more than that was gone. What remained was not a complete person. It was an edited version of one, shaped to serve a particular message. And that edited version is what billions of people have been handed as the truth for centuries. The monks in the highland monasteries of Ethiopia refused to go along with it. They read the same history everyone else had access to, and they recognized that something had been cut out of it. They understood that a version of human history that starts and ends with Eve's failure, with nothing else attached to her name, is not an honest account. It is a prosecution. They guarded these scrolls through centuries of invasion, political pressure, and religious interference because they believed that what Eve said in her final hours mattered. They called her the first teacher of the secret things, not the first sinner, not the origin of human failure, the first teacher, the person who carried the memory of paradise through nearly 1,000 years of exile and made sure it was passed on before she died. She did not die in shame. She died having delivered a prophecy that covered the flood, the fire, and the coming of a specific descendant who would reopen the gates of Eden. She died having seen Adam forgiven and restored. She died knowing the exile was not permanent. The establishment buried her testimony for over 1,000 years, and if something this significant could be hidden that completely, the real question is what else is still sitting in those caves in the Ethiopian highlands, waiting to be found. She carried the memory of paradise for nearly 1,000 years without letting it die. The question is, if you had lived through everything she lived through, would you have had the strength to do the same? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story moved you, hit subscribe.